How can one man's hatred turn into state policy? How is it possible that a personal obsession could end up feeding furnaces, gassing innocents, wiping out entire communities? Where did this fixation against the Jews come from, and why did so many follow it? The images are familiar: synagogues burning on Kristallnacht, families dragged into cattle cars, numbers tattooed on trembling arms, Hitler's face lit by floodlights, screaming from a balcony. But behind every image lies an unsettling question. Why them? Why did the Jews become the ultimate enemy, the scapegoat for a Reich that promised to last 1,000 years? The answer isn't found in a single moment or a single book. It wasn't a sudden outburst, nor an accident. It was a process. A mix of personal frustrations, inherited ideologies, national defeats, and poisonous myths that had been circulating long before Hitler was born. Today, we're going to follow that thread. From the bleak childhood of a failed young man in Austria to the industrial machinery of extermination that covered Europe in ashes. A harsh journey, but a necessary one. Because remembering isn't optional, it's a duty. Before the hatred, there was a dream, and that contrast is key to understanding it. He was born in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town on the German border, in 1889. His father, Alois, was a rigid, authoritarian customs officer. His mother, Clara, was the warmth of the household, the only person Hitler would ever remember with real affection, even at the end of his days. In Linz, where he spent his teenage years, Adolf showed a difficult temperament. Bad grades, constant arguments with his father, and a growing obsession with drawing and music. He was captivated by Wagner's operas, with their Germanic heroes and grand atmosphere. In that theater, he could escape from the mediocrity of everyday life. His father wanted him to become a civil servant. He dreamed of being an artist. At 18, after his mother's death from cancer, a devastating blow that sank him into loneliness, he moved to Vienna with one clear goal: to enter the Academy of Fine Arts. Twice he applied. Twice he was rejected. His exams showed the same pattern: skill in drawing buildings, but an inability to capture the human figure. His watercolors were neat, even pleasant, but not innovative. To the professors, he was just another amateur among thousands. For Hitler, it was brutal. He wasn't just failing, he was convincing himself the world was conspiring against him. That's when a dark chapter began. Wandering Vienna, living in shabby boarding houses, selling hand-painted postcards to survive. In winter, he spent hours in homeless shelters, sharing beds with laborers, unemployed workers, veterans. Meals came from charity kitchens. On those streets, he discovered a vibrant, chaotic city. Vienna was then the heart of a multi-ethnic empire. Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Italians, Croats, Jews. In the cafes, languages, newspapers, and political movements all collided. We need to pause here. Did he already hate Jews at this point? The evidence is contradictory. His landlady remembered a quiet, polite young man. Some companions said he didn't display open prejudice, and yet, decades later, he would claim that in Vienna, he learned to hate the Jews. How do we make sense of that contradiction? The key is that Vienna was also a hub of modern anti-Semitism. Mayor Karl Lueger used a populist, Catholic, anti-Jewish message to win votes, even though he privately dealt with Jewish bankers. Georg von Schönerer, another influential politician, preached a radical, violent pan-German nationalism, openly racist. Anti-Semitic pamphlets were sold at kiosks. Newspapers like the Deutsches Volksblatt repeated conspiracy theories. Hitler, isolated and resentful, soaked up this environment. He read voraciously but without method, pamphlets, propaganda, racial pseudoscience. In the shelters, he heard complaints about immigrants, communists, bankers. Little by little, his personal frustrations became tangled with these simplistic explanations. He had failed as an artist, but was convincing himself the blame wasn't his. It was the others, the Jews, the Czechs, the outsiders, who supposedly occupied the places he believed he deserved. Ironically, at the same time, he had respectful relationships with some Jews. The doctor who treated his mother, Eduard Bloch, was Jewish. Hitler always remembered him with gratitude, and once in power, ordered him protected in Linz. That detail complicates any simplistic reading. His anti-Semitism wasn't personal revenge. It was something more abstract, more ideological, because the hatred brewing in his mind didn't come from direct experience. It came from a narrative floating in the air. The idea that Jews were a threat to the nation, that they controlled finance, the press, the universities. False stories, but seductive to someone like him. Someone desperate for an explanation for his own failures. The contrast is stark. By day, a young man painting postcards of St. Stephen's Cathedral. By night, the same young man listening to fiery speeches on the Ringstrasse, watching crowds cheer politicians talking about race and degeneration. The paradox of Hitler in Vienna is that while he failed as an artist, he discovered another vocation, the politics of hatred. He didn't know it yet, but he was learning a language he would later wield with deadly precision. Short phrases, slogans, clear enemies. There's another crucial detail. Hitler became fascinated with the crowd. At Lueger's and Schönerer's rallies, he saw something that would mark his style forever. The power of collective emotion, the spell of the masses. He realized objective truth mattered little. What mattered was the effect. Years later in Mein Kampf, he would recall that people don't want complex analysis. They want simple slogans repeated 1,000 times. In Vienna, he understood that a leader doesn't win with arguments, but with passion. Meanwhile, his daily life kept unraveling. By 1910, he was already on the margins, wandering the city in worn clothes, increasingly isolated. But in his mind, the script was writing itself. He, the misunderstood genius, the world manipulated by hidden enemies, the future, a struggle to redeem Germany. History shows again and again how personal failures can morph into collective resentments. Hitler didn't invent anti-Semitism. He didn't invent racial theory. He didn't invent conspiracy myths. But in those years, his personal frustration fused with those ideas, and that cocktail proved deadly. By 1913, when he moved to Munich seeking a fresh start in Germany, he already carried an embryonic vision. Society was sick. Jews were the poison. The nation needed rebirth. He had no plan, no party, no followers, just a resentment in search of a cause. What he didn't know was that fate was about to hand him a stage far larger than Vienna, larger than his postcards and his miseries. In August 1914, the First World War would erupt, and Adolf Hitler's life would change forever. Even before hatred was institutionalized, even before Hitler became a politician, the ground was already fertile for anti-Semitism to grow. He didn't invent it. It was a poisoned inheritance, and he became its most fanatical disciple. Europe had spent centuries building myths against Jews. Since the Middle Ages, they'd been accused of killing Christ, of desecrating the host, of poisoning wells during the Black Plague. Lies repeated endlessly, fueling pogroms and expulsions. By the late 19th century, these old slanders had put on a new disguise: racial science. In labs and universities, people spoke of measuring skulls, of racial typologies, of blood purity. Pseudoscience, but dressed up in a lab coat. Anti-Semitism was modernized, no longer just religious. It became biological. In that view, being Jewish wasn't about faith, but blood. No conversion possible. It was a birthmark. Into this climate came one of the most influential and dangerous texts of the 20th century, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Published in Russia in 1903, it was a crude forgery pretending to record a secret Jewish plot to dominate the world. It spoke of controlling the press, manipulating governments, destroying Christian morality. None of it was true. The protocols were just a plagiarized satire from 19th century France, mixed with conspiracy theories. But in times of crisis, people weren't looking for evidence. They were looking for scapegoats. The text spread, translated into German, Austrian, French editions. Hitler would later read it and quote it as though it were genuine. In Vienna, these myths had powerful amplifiers. Karl Lueger, the city's mayor from 1897 to 1910, showed how to win elections with a populist message steeped in anti-Semitism. It didn't matter that he privately worked with Jewish bankers. What mattered was the effect on the masses. Hitler was impressed. What mattered about Lueger wasn't the accuracy of his facts, but the genius of his rhetoric, he would later recall. Another model was Georg von Schönerer, a pan-German leader who blended racial anti-Semitism with the dream of a greater Germany. At his rallies, flags waved, violent slogans were shouted, and a sense of belonging was cultivated by turning the enemy into something tangible. Hitler, a failed young man sleeping in boarding houses and selling postcards, watched it all. He was learning without realizing it, absorbing the conviction that the enemy wasn't poverty, unemployment, or corruption. It was an entire human group, and that hate-filled rhetoric could win power. But context matters. Vienna and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were in crisis. Nationalisms boiling over, social tensions, uneven modernization. When problems are that complex, simple explanations are seductive. It's the Jews' fault, they said. And millions accepted it because hating is easier than understanding. Hitler also immersed himself in conspiratorial literature. Pamphlets by Houston Stewart Chamberlain claiming the Aryan race was the bearer of culture, while Jews were destroyers. Magazines railing against supposed banking conspiracies. All of it gave him a tidy worldview, the world as a racial struggle. The paradox was obvious. Vienna had a thriving Jewish community, doctors, lawyers, merchants, artists. Freud was writing during those years. Mahler was conducting the opera. Cafes were buzzing with intellectual debate full of Jewish names. For a young man who had failed in his artistic dreams, seeing so many successful Jews only fueled envy, not because they had harmed him directly, but because their success reminded him of his own failure. That was the seed of his future rhetoric. Jews not as real individuals, but as a symbol, the other on whom to dump personal and collective frustrations. Over time, Hitler reframed his Vienna years as a revelation. In Mein Kampf, he wrote that it was there he first opened his eyes to the Jewish problem. But in truth, the young man in Vienna wasn't yet an organized fanatic. He was a drifter with prejudices floating around his head, unable to transform them into political action. The decisive turning point would come later, when those myths collided with the historical event that would shape him forever, the First World War. But before we get to the war, it's worth pausing to look at how the myth worked. Why did these ideas stick with so many people? First, because they named a clear enemy. Second, because they turned economic problems into a moral story. And third, because they were spread with powerful symbols, grotesque cartoons, slogans, political rituals. Jews were portrayed in propaganda as greedy bankers or as communist revolutionaries. It was an impossible double bind. Accused of running capitalism and, at the same time, of leading Bolshevism. How could they be both? It didn't matter. What mattered was that they were always cast as a threat. That absurdity would become central to Hitler's message. The Jew as the universal enemy, he would say in his speeches. The Wall Street financier and the Moscow agitator alike. The contradiction didn't weaken the claim, it strengthened it because it allowed Jews to be blamed for anything. Hitler didn't invent these theories, but he absorbed them. And, more importantly, he learned to voice them with the conviction of a true believer. In that process, Vienna was his incubator. He never got into the academy, he never made a name in art, but he came away with an ideological arsenal ready to use. In 1913, worn out, he moved to Munich. He hoped to start over there. What he didn't know was that the following year, the entire continent would explode into a war that would give final shape to his hatred. The aimless drifter was about to find purpose in a uniform, and his life would never be the same again. August 1914. Bells ringing, crowded squares, flags, anthems, speeches. Germany and Austria-Hungary go to war against the Entente powers. For millions, the news was a shock. For Adolf Hitler, it was a rebirth. He had been living in Munich since the previous year. No family, no profession, no future. Suddenly, the war offered him meaning. He volunteered for the Bavarian army, even though he was an Austrian subject. He was accepted, and for the first time in his life, he felt part of something bigger than himself. Hitler was assigned as a regimental courier on the Western Front. For 4 years, he carried messages between trenches under constant fire. It wasn't a high rank, but it was dangerous. His regiment remembered him as a dutiful, reserved, solitary soldier with no close friends. He received 2 decorations, the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class in 1918. The latter was unusual for a corporal. The recommendation came from a Jewish officer, Hugo Gutmann. A tragic irony. A Jew helped recognize the man who would later preach their extermination. The front shaped him. Life was brutal: mud, rats, corpses, mustard gas. And yet he would later describe it as the happiest time of his life. There he found camaraderie, order, purpose. There he convinced himself that Germany was fighting a sacred mission. In November 1918, after millions of deaths, Germany signed the armistice. The army, exhausted, could not go on. But many soldiers, like Hitler, experienced it as a sudden stab in the back. He was in a hospital in Passewalk, recovering from a gas attack that had affected his vision. That's where he learned of the surrender. He nearly lost his mind. Everything was collapsing, he would later write. And here a lethal myth was born, the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back. According to this idea, Germany hadn't been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by enemies within. Socialists, communists, and above all, Jews. It was false. The generals knew the front was lost. The troops were spent, civilians were starving. But the legend spread quickly because it offered a simple explanation for an unbearable disaster. Hitler clung to it fanatically. For him, the defeat wasn't a military fact, it was a plot. And in his mind, Jews stood at the center of that betrayal. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 deepened the resentment. Germany had to pay huge reparations, surrender territory, and accept sole guilt for the war. The country sank into hyperinflation, unemployment, and political chaos. In that environment, myths thrived. Communists had attempted revolutions in Berlin and Bavaria. Parties splintered. The newborn republic looked weak, and the question echoed, who got us into this mess? For Hitler and many others, the answer was clear: the Jews. It didn't matter that hundreds of thousands of German Jews had fought and died in the trenches. It didn't matter that many were sincere patriots. The myth didn't need facts, it needed culprits. After the war, Hitler stayed in the army as a guard in prisoner of war camps, and later as a political informant. His job was to attend meetings of small parties and report on their ideology. In September 1919, he attended a session of the tiny German Workers' Party, DAP. He listened to a speaker and, annoyed, got up to argue. His fury, his voice, his conviction stunned everyone. It was the first time he tasted his talent as an agitator. The party leaders invited him to join. Hitler accepted. Up to that moment, he was a man without direction. Now he had a stage. Politics offered what art had denied him, an audience. In Munich's beer halls, he began to speak, and he discovered he could electrify a room with short lines, with shouts, with hate. National frustration was his raw material. His enemy never changed, the Jews. The war had turned his vague prejudices into a total fixation. He was no longer the frustrated youth eyeing Vienna's Jews with resentment. He was convinced they were Germany's existential enemy. In his speeches, he portrayed them as parasites, conspirators, corruptors of culture. To him, the Jew was responsible for cutthroat capitalism and, at the same time, for revolutionary communism, a contradiction no one seemed to mind. Hatred, repeated often enough, hardened into truth, and with every speech, more heads nodded along. In the following months, Hitler became the little party's star speaker. His charisma stood in stark contrast to his mediocrity in everything else. That's where he began building what would become the NSDAP, the National Socialist Party. And so, from an anonymous soldier, a failed painter, a Viennese drifter, there emerged an agitator with a dangerous message. The First World War had been his catalyst. It gave him an enemy, a myth, a mission. What came next wouldn't be mere ranting. It would be organization, party, propaganda. The end of the war left Germany reeling. Hunger, inflation, strikes, failed revolutions. Munich's streets were a boiling mix of radical groups. Communists, monarchists, nationalists. In that chaos, Adolf Hitler found his stage. In 1919, the German Workers' Party, DAP, was a non-entity, a few dozen members meeting in smoke-filled beer halls. Their slogans were simple: extreme nationalism, hatred of Marxism, antisemitism. Hitler arrived as an army spy, sent to listen and report. But soon, the mole became the main act. One evening, after a debate, he stood up to defend Germany. His shouts, his gestures, the fury in his voice left the audience stunned. That's when he discovered his gift. He couldn't paint, he couldn't write clearly, but he could speak. The party asked him to join. In no time, he was their best orator. Hitler understood that politics is theater. He staged his appearances like a show, arriving late, letting the tension build, starting softly and ending in a shout, fist raised, eyes blazing. He knew how to use silence, pauses, repetition, short sentences, easy slogans. Germany, wake up. The Jew is our enemy. These weren't arguments. They were emotional hammer blows. The crowds responded. Unemployed workers, embittered veterans, young men with no future. They all wanted someone to blame. Hitler handed them one. Antisemitism became the backbone of his message. He cast Jews as universal conspirators, guilty of rapacious capitalism and Bolshevik communism, of the wartime defeat, of cultural decay. In his story, they were the absolute enemy. In 1920, the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP. The new label fused nationalism with the word socialist, appealing to disaffected workers. Hitler rolled out powerful symbols: the red and black swastika, the outstretched arm salute, paramilitary uniforms. Everything signaled strength, order, identity. Soon, the rallies drew thousands. The party was still small, but each speech lit more fires. In November 1923, Hitler decided the time had come to seize power. Inspired by Mussolini in Italy, he staged a coup in Munich, the beer hall putsch. Pistol in hand, he burst into a political meeting and proclaimed the revolution. His followers marched through the streets, but the police confronted them. The coup was a fiasco. 16 Nazis were killed, and Hitler was arrested. It looked like the end, but it turned into a new beginning. In Landsberg prison, Adolf Hitler dictated to his loyal aide Rudolf Hess a book that would leave its mark on history, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The manuscript was rambling, repetitive, full of personal obsessions. Yet amid the chaos, there was a disturbing clarity. Hitler argued that Germany had lost the war because of the Jews. He described them as a supposed race that had to be eliminated. He claimed the German people's destiny was to expand eastward in search of what he called Lebensraum, living space, and he declared that the state should be built not on democratic principles, but on racial ones. It wasn't a detailed political program so much as an ideological confession, but everything he would later carry out was already there in black and white. In its early years, the book sold only a handful of copies. Over time, millions of Germans would read it, or at least hear its ideas repeated. No one could say they hadn't been warned. Released in 1924, Hitler set about rebuilding the party. He learned his lesson. Coups weren't enough. Power had to be won legally. During the relatively stable Weimar years, 1924 to 1929, the NSDAP remained a fringe group, but it kept up a steady drumbeat of rallies, marches, and propaganda. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, everything changed. Millions were thrown out of work, banks failed, desperation spread. And in that context, Hitler's message sounded louder. Germany wasn't in crisis because of economics, but because of betrayal and because of the Jewish enemy. The votes began to surge. From 12 seats in 1928, they jumped to 107 in 1930. By 1932, they were the largest party in the Reichstag. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor. Many underestimated him. They saw him as a useful rabble-rouser, a politician who could be kept in check. They were wrong. Within months, Hitler had locked in a dictatorship. After the Reichstag fire, he stripped away freedoms, banned political parties, and created the Gestapo. The Third Reich had been born. Hatred would no longer be just rhetoric. Now it had the power of the state behind it. And what followed was no longer words. It was law. January 30th, 1933, Berlin. An aging field marshal, Paul von Hindenburg, swears in the new chancellor of the Reich, Adolf Hitler. Outside, torchlight parades set the night aglow. Many believe this is just a trial run, that the firebrand will mellow once in office. They're mistaken. Within weeks, the regime is cemented. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 serves as a pretext to suspend civil liberties. The Reichstag fire decree allows arrests without trial, censorship, and persecution of opponents. In March, the Enabling Act grants Hitler dictatorial powers. Parliament no longer matters. German democracy is dead. And soon, the hatred that for years had been the stuff of beer hall rants becomes official policy. April 1933, a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. Uniformed SA men stand outside shops with signs reading, "Don't buy from Jews." Windows smashed, graffiti, intimidation. That same month, the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service expels Jews from state jobs, judges, teachers, public hospital doctors. Exclusion is no longer social, it's legal. More laws follow, barring Jews from practicing as lawyers, journalists, notaries. With each month, professional life narrows further. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, turns anti-Semitism into the air everyone breathes. Films like The Eternal Jew show grotesque caricatures. Magazines like Der Stürmer print drawings of hooked noses and sinister eyes. In schools, children are taught racial pseudoscience, skull charts, tests of blood purity. Hatred is taught as biology. The lie of the so-called protocols of the Elders of Zion circulates as if it were genuine. No one in power admits the truth. It's a forgery. And in practice, its authenticity matters little. The only thing that counts is the effect. September 1935. At the Nuremberg Party rally, Adolf Hitler announces a new legal framework for the Third Reich. First, the so-called Reich Citizenship Law. From now on, only those of German blood are full citizens. Then, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. It bans marriage and sexual relations between Jews and so-called Aryans. From there, the regime rolls out meticulous categories to determine who counts as Jewish, tracing grandparents, lineage, ancestry. An obsessive, bureaucratic system that reaches into the private lives of families and decides their fate. With the stroke of a pen, German Jews become second-class citizens. They can't vote, can't marry freely, and are barred from many professions. Many Germans who have no personal contact with Jews absorb propaganda as if it were reality. The Jew becomes an abstract, demonized figure, the culprit for every ill. Others keep quiet. The persecution advances step by step, slow enough to seem reversible. Maybe it stops here, they think, but it never does. Some, meanwhile, collaborate actively, denouncing neighbors, joining boycotts, parroting slogans. Complicity isn't always fanaticism. Often it's fear, conformity, opportunism. November 9th, 1938. An organized mob burns more than 1,000 synagogues across Germany and Austria. Businesses are looted. Around 30,000 people are arrested. Shards of glass cover the streets, hence the name Kristallnacht. The pretext was the murder of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Polish Jew. But the violence was orchestrated from above. For the first time, persecution becomes openly violent and massive. It's a point of no return. Insurance companies don't pay Jewish owners for damages. On the contrary, they're forced to cover public repairs. A brutal cynicism. The news spreads. There are international condemnations, headlines, speeches in parliaments. But in practice, almost no country opens its borders to Jewish refugees. In 1938, the Evian Conference gathered 32 nations to discuss the refugee crisis. Almost all refused to take more in. Only the Dominican Republic offered a few thousand visas. To the Nazis, the message is clear. The world protests, but doesn't act. And if it doesn't act, persecution can keep escalating. By 1939, about 400,000 Jews had managed to flee Germany. But more than 200,000 remained trapped. And soon, with war, millions more would fall under Nazi rule in Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, the Netherlands. Hatred was no longer just a bundle of discriminatory laws. It was a program on the march. Every territorial conquest added entire Jewish communities to the regime's reach. Legal exclusion was turning into something far more sinister. Seen in hindsight, the path is clear. First, words, then laws, then violence. Finally, extermination. In 1933, many thought the Nazis only wanted to curb Jewish influence. In 1935, that they merely sought segregation. In 1938, that the violence would blow over. But each step was a rung on a ladder leading to the gas chambers. By 1939, Europe stood on the brink. Within months, war would transform Nazi persecution into something far deadlier. Ghettos, mass shootings, extermination camps. The machinery of hate that began with beer hall speeches now engulfs an entire continent. What came next wasn't marginalization or expulsion or even pogroms. It was a systematic attempt to wipe a people off the face of the earth. And the worst was just beginning. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland. The Second World War begins. And with it, Nazi antisemitism reaches a new level. More than 3 million Jews lived in Poland, the largest community in Europe. Under German occupation, they became the first major testing ground for Nazi racial policy. Orders came swiftly: mandatory identification with the Star of David, confiscation of property, forced labor, and most brutal of all, confinement in ghettos. Warsaw, Łódź, Krakow, entire districts walled off. Hundreds of thousands crammed into a few square kilometers, meager food rations, no medicine. Hunger, typhus, and squalor turned into weapons. Photos from those ghettos show barefoot children with hollow eyes, women selling the last things they owned, bodies in the streets. The Nazis themselves documented it as if it were an experiment. June 1941. Operation Barbarossa held the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Here, hatred turns into direct extermination. Behind the troops come the Einsatzgruppen, SS mobile killing squads. Their mission: eliminate Jews, political commissars, intellectuals. In practice, anyone who fits the category of racial enemy. The reports are chilling. At Babi Yar, near Kyiv, in September 1941, more than 33,000 Jews were shot in just 2 days. Men, women, children thrown into a ravine. It was one of many such episodes in Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. The logic was relentless. Wherever the German army went, Jews were to disappear. But mass shootings posed problems: psychological for the killers, logistical for the regime. Thousands of bullets, hundreds of men traumatized by shooting women and children. The Nazi machine sought efficiency. The answer was the final solution to the Jewish question. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, senior officials planned the systematic deportation of 11 million European Jews to extermination centers. This wasn't improvisation, it was administration, train timetables, transport calculations. Genocide with a bureaucratic stamp. Concentration camps had existed since 1933, like Dachau. But beginning in 1941, camps designed solely for killing were built. Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and the most infamous, Auschwitz-Birkenau. The process was planned with cold precision. Packed trains arrived day and night, full of men, women, and children. On the selection ramp, some able-bodied men were sent to forced labor, but most, the elderly, women, children, were sent straight to their deaths. The gas chambers were disguised as showers. From openings in the ceiling, pellets of Zyklon B were dropped, releasing a lethal gas. The bodies were then moved to the crematoria, which ran non-stop, day and night. At Auschwitz, up to 6,000 people could be murdered in a single day. The smoke from the furnaces blackened the sky. Trains rolled past German and Polish towns. People saw, smelled, knew. Some collaborated, some kept quiet out of fear, others out of indifference. The Vatican, Allied governments, diplomats, many had clues by 1942. There were isolated protests, but the sheer scale of the horror seemed unimaginable. The world was slow to react. In the end, nearly 6 million Jews were murdered, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. Entire cities and centuries-old cultures wiped out. Every number is a life cut short. A child from Warsaw, a grandmother from Vilnius, a rabbi from Prague, a violinist from Vienna. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a wartime excess. It was a systematic plan, executed with precision, shielded by a modern state. Amid the horror, there were flashes of resistance. Uprisings in ghettos like Warsaw in 1943, where men and women fought tanks with makeshift weapons. Revolts in camps like Sobibor and Treblinka, where prisoners organized mass escapes. There were also those who risked everything to save lives. Polish families hiding children, diplomats like Raoul Wallenberg forging passports, villagers sharing their bread. but they were the minority. Most chose to look the other way. Let's retrace the path. In Vienna, a frustrated young man paid close attention to the racist pamphlets circulating in the streets. In the post-war years, that same defeated soldier embraced the idea of the stab in the back, convinced that Germany had been betrayed. In Munich, the rabble-rouser turned that hatred into a political movement that spread through the masses. And in Berlin, now as chancellor, he turned the myth into law, giving it a power that would change history forever. And in Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, that hatred turned into smoke, ash, emptiness. By 1944, the war had turned against Germany. The Allies advanced from the west, the Red Army from the east. Even so, the trains kept running. Even when defeat was inevitable, the Nazis prioritized extermination over military survival. That obsession shows just how completely hatred had consumed the regime. It wasn't strategy, it was pure fanaticism. In January 1945, Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz. They found mountains of shoes, piles of hair, suitcases marked with names, and a handful of survivors, starved, barely strong enough to smile at their liberators. What the world discovered in those days defied imagination. Stacked bodies, crematoria, hidden diaries, testimonies that froze the blood. The word Holocaust was only beginning to be used, but the reality was already seared into humanity's conscience. April 1945. Berlin is burning under the bombs. In an underground bunker, a cornered Adolf Hitler dictates his last orders. Outside, the Third Reich collapses. The man who turned hatred into a system is about to take his own life. But the damage is done. 6 million Jews murdered, along with millions of other victims of Nazism. In the first months of 1945, Allied armies liberated the camps, Soviets at Auschwitz and Majdanek, the British at Bergen-Belsen, the Americans at Buchenwald and Dachau. The images circled the globe. Skeletal prisoners, piles of corpses, ovens still warm. Soldiers hardened by years of war wept at the sight. There were no words. The silence of witnesses said more than any speech. For many Germans, it was the first time they faced the sheer scale of the crime. Some had suspected, others had heard rumors, but seeing the camps was something else. Troops forced nearby villagers to enter and look. The goal, that no one could ever say, "We didn't know." The world discovered not only the savagery of war, but the machinery of genocide. And the great question arose, how was this possible? In November 1945, the International Military Tribunal opened in Nuremberg. 24 top Nazi officials were tried for war crimes, crimes against humanity, conspiracy to wage aggressive war. The hearings revealed documents, orders, memos. It wasn't madness. It wasn't isolated soldiers going too far. It was a system, planned, signed, carried out. Evidence included films shot by the Nazis themselves, survivors' testimonies, confessions. The judges set a precedent. Just following orders is no defense. Some defendants were sentenced to death, others to long prison terms. But beyond the verdicts, Nuremberg marked a turning point. For the first time, a modern state was tried for genocide. Meanwhile, millions of survivors wandered Europe, the so-called displaced persons. No homes, no families, no communities. Makeshift refugee camps filled with liberated Jews who had nowhere to go. Going back was often impossible. In many cases, their homes had been taken. In Poland, some who tried to return were met with violence. The Jewish diaspora was reshaped. Many emigrated to the United States, to Latin America, others to Palestine, where in 1948 the State of Israel would be founded, its existence stamped by the memory of the Shoah. The Holocaust left deep scars, not only demographic, with entire communities erased, but cultural, theological, philosophical. Philosophers asked, How could the Enlightenment, science, German culture produce Auschwitz? What does civilization mean after extermination camps? Churches confronted their silence. Many religious leaders said nothing while synagogues burned. That guilt would mark decades of reflection. Back to the starting question, why did Hitler hate the Jews? The answer isn't a childhood incident or a single trauma. It wasn't because a Jewish teacher rejected him or a Jewish doctor treated him poorly. On the contrary, specific cases often show respectful treatment. Hitler's hatred didn't appear out of thin air. It was the result of a dangerous fusion of factors. On one side, his personal frustrations, failure as an artist, the poverty he endured in Vienna, the loneliness that trailed him. To that were added ideological influences. The political anti-Semitism of figures like Karl Lueger and Georg von Schönerer, the racial pseudoscience that pretended to rank human beings, and the lie of the so-called protocols of the elders of Zion. History did the rest. Germany's defeat in the First World War, the stab-in-the-back myth, and the deep crises of the Weimar Republic. And finally, political convenience. Anti-Semitism became a powerful tool to unite diverse crowds around a common enemy. It wasn't an accident, it was a way of thinking, fueled by decades of European prejudice. Hitler radicalized it, simplified it, and turned it into the central engine of his politics. Anti-Semitism explained everything for him. Defeat, crisis, unemployment, cultural decay. And at the same time, it offered a messianic mission: eliminate the Jews to redeem Germany. So his hatred wasn't irrational within its own twisted logic. It was consistent with a world of lies, myths, and fanaticism, and that consistency made it even more dangerous. The Holocaust isn't only Jewish history, it's human history. It shows what happens when dehumanization becomes the norm, when lies replace truth, when hatred becomes law. The warning signs were all there: speeches, cartoons, laws, pogroms. Extermination didn't begin with ovens, it began with words. That's the warning for our time. Every time a group is blamed for everything, every time conspiracy theories spread, every time mockery or hatred is normalized, the path begins to repeat. Today, camps like Auschwitz or Dachau are museums of memory. The survivors, fewer every year, tell their stories so silence won't devour remembrance. The motto, "Never Again," isn't an empty slogan. It's a commitment. Because forgetting opens the door to repetition. The question we began with still echoes. How did one man's hatred become state policy? The answer is clear, because that hatred fed on ancient myths, found modern accomplices, and millions either accepted it or stayed silent. Adolf Hitler died in a bunker in 1945. The Reich that promised 1,000 years lasted barely 12, but the scars it left endure. 6 million lives extinguished, entire communities erased. A warning that never loses its force. Remembering isn't optional. It's a duty, because the memory of the victims demands a clear, resounding answer. Never again. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.